In a CBS News special series, we're asking experts about what critical issues the next president will face the moment he or she takes office.
Foreign Affairs correspondent Margaret Brennan sat down with former CIA Director General David Petraeus. She asked him about the challenges the new president will face with Iraq on day one.
What concerns you the most about Iraq right now?
Iraqi politics. We'll defeat the Islamic State. That's going to happen. It's just a question of how long it takes. But it's Iraqi politics that have to become more inclusive if you're to cement the gains on the battlefield.
When the next president takes office, what's the best case scenario that he or she will face in Iraq?
The best case scenario would be one in which the Islamic State has been defeated on the battlefield, and its terrorist cells have been reduced dramatically, and even the residual guerrillas, insurgents are on the run. Then, most importantly, that politics in Baghdad have been sufficiently inclusive so that the Sunni Arabs of Iraq once again feel a stake in the success of the new Iraq rather than in its failure.
What's the worst case scenario for the U.S.?
The worst case scenario for the U.S. is if the situation goes seriously south for some reason, and all of a sudden we find ourselves having to really augment our forces and perhaps even get them more into the actual fighting to forestall the possibility of a collapse of Iraq and perhaps the resumption of the kind of very near civil war that we saw back in 2006.
How thin is that line between success and failure?
Well, the line between success and failure is all about Baghdad politics. That's where this will play out.
For the next president, will they have to speak to the American public and talk about Americans dying in combat in Iraq once again?
I fear that that probably is the case, that future presidents will have Americans dying in places like Iraq. This is really a generational struggle.
Well, Margaret Brennan is here with us. Margaret, thanks for joining us. So Iraq will be the major challenge, General Petraeus says. Where do the candidates stand on Iraq?
Well, Iraq, a huge challenge, not only because it's right in the center of the Middle East, next to Iran, next to Syria, two very hostile states right now with crises alone, but also because this is such a haven for ISIS to continue to grow. So Hillary Clinton, when she's spoken about Iraq, she said, I'm going to handle the diplomacy, strengthen the existing government in Baghdad, while also basically doing a lot of what President Obama is already doing to bolster local forces to fight ISIS and perhaps increase some of that military support. Donald Trump, it's been hard to discern what the strategy is exactly. He has said he would increase airstrikes against ISIS, but he said conflicting things when it comes to ground troops. He said that military advisors told him it would take between 20 to 30,000 troops to really clean out ISIS, but then he also said, while he listened to the generals, he doesn't actually want to put boots on the ground. So it's not clear exactly where they stand, but both obviously think that there needs to be some continued military response.
Although, and again, with some of the conflicts, at one point in his speech this week, he said, back in when he would have kept the oil, keep the oil, keep the oil. I kept saying keep the oil. On the other hand, he says, I don't want to go into nation building. So how do you, the only way for the United States to keep the oil, quote unquote, is to become an imperial power and take control of Iraq. That was never the plan.
No, yeah. and you know, it was the Bush era agreement to draw down troops that started really to move out the U.S. military presence, and then President Obama tried to renegotiate that, had no luck with the then Maliki government to try to keep more U.S. forces on the ground. And the problem is, and that gets at the heart of what, interestingly, a military general here is saying, don't just look at the battlefield. You got to give me diplomats. You have to really support the next Secretary of State, whoever that is, by putting people out on the ground, outside the wire, who can try to keep a government together, because it's got to be the diplomacy and the military hand in hand there. And that's where the current administration has gotten a lot of criticism. But when you withdraw troops, can you put diplomats safely on the ground without a military to protect them? And that was the challenge, and that's why so many diplomats were pulled out of Baghdad. I mean, you walk around that embassy, I've been there, it's the biggest U.S. embassy in the world, and it is virtually empty.
Wow. I'm just curious, you know, part of Donald Trump's narrative is, you know, we've heard it over the past few days, Hillary Clinton and President Obama are co-founders of ISIS. Right. I'm curious what General Petraeus makes of that assertion?
Well, he feels pretty strongly about this, given that, he was a U.S. commander in Iraq. He took on the predecessor to ISIS, Al-Qaeda in Iraq. So he traces it back, knowing full well it goes back to 07, 08, when the Obama administration was not in power, the roots of the terror group that has now become even more powerful than Al-Qaeda. So he sees this on a very detailed level as really a response in some way to the American invasion, but also longer-term divisions with the Iraqi government not supporting the Sunni population of that country, alienating them. Then you also have Iran interfering here and backing Shiite militias. So it really gets down to people feeling invested and feeling that they can keep the state together and protect it. And that gets at the heart of why the Iraqi army didn't stand up and fight. Remember, they just melted away when ISIS rose. So that's why they're saying focus on the diplomacy here. And the Prime Minister of Iraq, Abadi, he's not very strong. He's having some political problems, but basically he's the best chance you got. And that's what Petraeus and others are saying. You got to help strengthen him. And he's advising any next president to focus on that, not just bombing ISIS.
And it's interesting, Margaret, and we're really looking forward to the rest of this series because these are some of the things that candidates should be talking about, and yet we're stuck
we don't get to.
We don't get to, yeah, exactly. So you're talking to General Hayden next. He was the director of the CIA, right?
Exactly, and we're going to be looking at one of the longer-term risks and challenges, and that's China. If you think ISIS is complicated, wow, this is a whole other, five-dimensional chessboard of geopolitics to tackle.
Looking forward to that. Margaret Brennan, always good to have you. Thank you.
Thank you.